Okay, so we're back. And our next guests are 911 Truth, and I'm going to bring them right in. And we're first going to bring in, hold on just a second. Bruce, happy to have you. Diana, happy to have you. And Richard, happy to have you.
Hi.
Hi, everyone.
How are you
Hi,
guys
Penny.
doing today?
Good. Thank you very much for having us, and we're very happy to have Richard. I'm just gonna briefly give an introduction of how I met him. I met him in DC at a conference, and then the most exciting thing was in Spain. We had him in 2008 at the Colegio Oficial de Arquitectura de Madrid, which is the official architectural school of Madrid. And they had him, and there was like 6,000 people, it was a huge crowd. They had mainstream news covering it. I don't think they realized before what he was going to be talking about. They had live translation services. So, and Telecinco, which is one of the big channels over there, asked me to send the PowerPoint at 3 a.m. They said, send me the PowerPoint and we'll put them on tomorrow morning. So I sent it. And the next morning, one of our team saw him on TV, on mainstream TV. They did a big show about, well, it was a 5-minute clip about Richard Gage showing videos of Building 7 coming down. And I called the lady that I had a contact with at Telecinco, and I was like, "Oh, is this going to be on tonight too?" She goes, "Yeah, it's going to be running every few hours." And of course, it was never on again.
Wow.
And Bruce is Richard is very brave, and I think it's when people ask me, "Aren't you afraid?" I think I say no, because we're the ones that aren't doing anything wrong. They're the ones who are doing something wrong, and people feel the same way. Bruce, do you want to comment about how you know Richard?
Yes, thank you. And Penny, thanks again for having us back on your show. It's great to be back here for another episode. Again, my name is Bruce Stanley, a longtime organizer and former candidate for Florida governor. Our guest is very special today. Very few people have done as much work on the topic of 9/11 truth as Richard Gage. I've been following his work since the beginning. If you're not familiar, he's been speaking out about the issue for over 15 years now, doing countless interviews, guest appearances, tabling at events, you name it. I was proud to have met him back in 2016 when we put together a Miami stop on his nationwide tour that year with the firefighters for 9/11 Truth. And I remember one day I just happened to flip on C-SPAN, and there was Richard Gage right in the living room, reaching a wide audience and getting his message into the public record. He'd been doing vital work with architects and engineers for 9/11 Truth. I'm sure we're going to be talking about this, but I think we've all benefited from the fact that he's now unleashed and free to weigh in on other topics beyond just the structural engineering aspects of 9/11. He's on all the major platforms, and I would encourage you to check out his work at richardgage911.org. So welcome to the show, Richard, and we're looking forward to your presentation.
Thank you, Bruce. Appreciate that so much. Thank you, Diana.
Okay, so are you guys? Oh, hold on just a second. I have another guest, host Rainey Robinson.
Hey.
Hi, everybody.
I told Rainey she had to engage for this one because this is going to be one fabulous segment on our show. Everyone introduce themselves. Richard Gage, can you tell us a little bit about yourself? And I'm going to bring in your presentation.
Yeah, I was shocked to hear on the radio 2006, David Ray Griffin being interviewed. He's written now 14 books on the subject of 9/11 truth. And I had heard no alternative theory ever about how these towers came down on 9/11, or that there was a third skyscraper that collapsed on 9/11. So this just woke me up. I mean, I was a flag-waving Reagan Republican ready to go in and get those you-know-whats that did this to us. And boy, was I in for a rude awakening. We had been lied to. The entire world had been gaslighted. Turns out that the evidence that David Ray Griffin introduced me on that day Um, he was talking about 4-ton structural steel sections out of the Twin Towers ejected laterally at 80 miles an hour, landing 600 feet in every direction, dripping with molten metal. We're going to go through that today. But it launched me. I had to figure this out. Is this true? Is he lying to me? Is this the biggest scam that's ever been perpetrated
Right.
on the American people? So we have. I took as much information as I could over the next couple of months, put it together in a PowerPoint, took it to my architecture firm because I had been talking about what I had learned, and they kind of thought I was nuts, most of them. And yet I bought them pizza. I made them come in, and they listened for 45 minutes. After that presentation, every hand went up in the room. Oh my God, you're right. These are controlled demolitions. We've got to do something.
And Richard, I wanted to just let you know, in the event that you can't get, we generally close at about 55 on the hour. If you can't get through everything, we entreat you to come back again and again.
Oh, well, that's sweet of you, because what we have prepared for you is Building 7 today in a very light format. We're going to, I have an in-depth presentation just on Building 7. It's 2 hours.
Wow.
So we're going to highlight over the most essential points today.
Okay. Did you want to advance do you want to start it?
Sure. Are you ready to rock and roll? Most people don't even know. People don't even know about the third worst structural failure in modern history. I mean, we're going to talk about it, but I'm an architect. I'm one of 90,000 members of the American Institute of Architects, and we didn't receive one bulletin on this after the Twin Towers, the worst structural failure in modern history. It should have been the most studied building failure ever, and yet it was just eliminated from the colleges, the universities, the professional institutions. It's incredible. This is the building we're talking about right here. In fact, let me plug this in. Hold on. This building is just north of the World Trade Center, just right across the street. It's part of the World Trade Center. It's building number 7. It was built in the 80s. Larry Silverstein is the developer. Now, after 9/11, about 6 weeks before 9/11, he acquired the entire World Trade Center superblock that you see here. And that's the big, it includes building 1, the North Tower, and building 2, the South Tower. So now this building, World Trade Center 7, was not hit by a plane. So why are we talking about it? Because it was destroyed nevertheless. Here it is on the right. And it's about 100 yards from the North Tower. And indeed, some of the beams from the North Tower hit it that far away because they were ejected, in fact, up to 600 feet in every direction. That's a couple of football fields. So, but here it is standing just fine, despite some damage, which NIST, the National Institute of Standards and Technology, who was tasked by Congress to explain these collapses to the American people, they said, no, that was not a significant factor in the building's collapse. Well, what was?
Right.
Let's watch the building. Here's the east penthouse falling first, up at the top, an isolated event. And then 6 seconds later, this happens.
Wow.
Now, have you guys seen this before on TV?
Not that one.
Oh, not that angle, no.
But anything that looks like it at all?
Oh, well, yes.
Okay.
Yes.
We're talking about like the old hotels in Las Vegas,
Yes.
right? When they bring them down with controlled demolitions. So it looks exactly like a controlled demolition. And yet NIST, who NIST never seriously considered this in any of their working hypotheses. They went straight toward the official narrative that the building came down by fire. In fact, they reinforced that. In fact, here is Shyam Sundar of NIST telling us just that.
What we found was that uncontrolled building fires caused an extraordinary event. The collapse of World Trade Center 7 was primarily due to fire.
Okay, fires caused this building to come down. Hey,
Right.
let's look at those fires, because these are the worst fires that we have photographic or video evidence of in the building. As you can see, they're few, they're relatively small, and they're scattered throughout the building. So those fires are going to bring that building down like we just saw. Let's listen further here to Shyam Sundar.
Our study has identified thermal expansion as a new phenomenon that can cause the collapse of a structure. For the first time, we have shown that fire can induce a progressive collapse.
Wait a minute. When
And
he
you can
says
see
when he says for the first time, he's not kidding. No steel frame, fire protected skyscraper has ever collapsed from fire. And yet there are dozens and dozens of examples. I'll show you a few. But let's go further and listen to the rest of what he says.
And you can see on the screen, the column at the very right is column 79. And that's the column that first buckles, causing the floors to come down, followed by a quick succession of failures of adjoining column.
So they're using a computer model to try to explain, i.e. reverse engineer, the collapse of the building to try to make to try to give an explanation that would ward off the architects and engineers. But look at this building. This building is full of incredible iron. It's a moment resisting steel frame building. Could it have come down at free fall acceleration in 6.5 seconds through this structure? That if any of those columns and beams gave any resistance to this building's collapse, it would have taken 30, 40 seconds, a minute, 10 minutes to collapse if it was going to collapse at all. This structure is absolutely incredible and impervious and 5 times stronger than it needed to be, because that's what you do with skyscrapers, just in case something goes wrong. They have to have a safety factor built in, because fires do happen in buildings. There's been at least 6, 7, 8 dozen much larger, much longer lasting, and much hotter fires in these types of buildings. And yet not one of them has ever come down, not even since 9/11, when we have so many. In the last few months, there's been like
Wow.
3 of them. So we look at the set of features of controlled demolition and we compare building 7 to them. The first one, is there a sudden onset of destruction? Well, here's Dan Rather. Let's listen to it. Oh.
And what you're seeing are high shots. Now, here we're going to show you a videotape of the collapse itself. Describe that. Now we go to videotape, the collapse of this building.
It's amazing.
Amazing, incredible, pick your word. For the 3rd time today, it's reminiscent of those pictures we've all seen too much on television before, when a building was deliberately destroyed by well-placed dynamite to knock it down.
What?
Right.
Deliberately destroyed by well-placed dynamite
To knock it down.
Yeah, Dan is using his intuition here, right? We've all seen these old hotels in Las Vegas, and it's fascinating to watch. That's the only way these buildings come down. So we appreciate that. But Dan never mentioned this
I
on
was going to
TV,
say, did Dan ever reiterate that statement again on air?
not once. In fact, we've not seen this building come down on mainstream television, with maybe 2 exceptions very early on. It is like been banned. And yet, again, it should have been the most studied structural failure ever. No plane hit this building. How does it come down straight down symmetrical? Well, let's go look from West Street, straight down, pretty symmetrical, exactly like a controlled demolition. It should have been the first hypothesis that NIST examined, but no, they chose the most unlikely one and shelved the most likely hypothesis, completely violating the scientific method. This is the abuse of science. One of the 12 parallels that we see between 9/11 and COVID, the complete abuse of science. We'll go over the other 12 parallels when we have a chance.
Yes.
But yeah, the building falls right down into its own footprint. The way you do that is to take out the core columns, followed by the perimeter columns a second later on every floor. And does fire have that level of precision? These are the core columns where the elevators are and the other services in the building. They have to go down a second before the perimeter on every floor. If even one of those columns gave any resistance, you could not have free fall acceleration, which we'll get to. But these fires are what caused that level of precision. You begin to see the problem and why we start with Building 7. It is such a classic case of lying and fraud in the NIST report that when people see it, they go, oh my God, I've been lied to. And this is what got me so angry 18 years ago now. I looked at the comparison of a controlled demolition on the right, series of them, and Building 7 on the left. Is there any similarity?
It's identical to me.
Yeah, well, there's at least enough similarity, right, to warrant an investigation into the possible use of explosives to bring the building down. But no, it was only added 10 years later to their website in the very frequently asked questions, FAQs, 10 years later. It's like they got inundated with responses, so they had to deal with it. But those fires brought that building down symmetrically.
It almost
sounds of it
more
go ahead.
symmetrical than the other buildings. It's like they did a better job on 7 going symmetrically down than the other examples you gave. They were tilting and 7 just went straight.
And when we come back, again, we'll look at the Twin Towers. Here, did we have witnesses of explosions? Let's first listen to the official narrative here.
We did not find any evidence that explosives were used in the collapse of Building 7. We ran down detailed computer simulations of blast scenarios. This size blast would have produced an incredibly loud sound that was not recorded on videos of the collapse nor reported by witnesses.
No? Let's listen to a few of them. Here's Daryl, a medical student, that evening on 1010 Winds Radio in New York City.
We were watching the building actually because it was on fire. The bottom floors of the building were on fire, and we heard this sound that sounded like a clap of thunder. Turned around, we were shocked to see that the building was it looked like there was a shock wave ripping through the building, and the windows all busted out, and it was horrifying. Then about a second later, the bottom floor caves out, and the building followed after that, and we saw the building crash down all the way to the ground.
Wow. A shockwave ripping through the building, the windows busting out, a sound of a clap of thunder, then the building coming down to the ground about a second later. How about this gentleman, Kevin McPadden, former Air Force medic, on hand.
And then it was like another 2-3 seconds. You heard explosions, like boom. It's like a distinct sound. It's not like when in compression, like boom, 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 like floors that were dropping and collapsing. This was boom, and like you felt a rumble in the ground, like almost like you wanted to grab onto something. That, to me, I knew that was an explosion. There was no doubt in my mind.
And this gentleman.
I'm going to call in Bill Rosati. He was here when it all happened. He saw it for himself. Bill, if you can just tell us what you saw, what you heard.
I was standing like 2 blocks away, and all of a sudden I just seen a big flash, and then I seen the building coming down, and I just seen people just running everywhere, chaotic like.
A big flash. How about this gentleman who, along with Mayor Giuliani's attorney, Michael Hess, Barry Jennings and he were called to an emergency meeting because a plane had just hit the towers. So they arrived late because by the time the second plane hit the second tower, everybody else had evacuated out of the building. These guys didn't know that. Apparently nobody put a sign on the door. And they got all the way up to the 23rd floor, and this is their experience, and there was nobody there. Here's their experience coming back.
When we got to the 8th floor, I started walking to one side of the building. That side of the building was gone. The first explosion I heard when I was on the stairwell landing, when we made it down to the 6th floor. Then we made it back to the 8th floor. I heard some more explosions.
What's the sound?
Like a boom, like an explosion.
More than one?
Yes. We started walking down the stairs. We made it to the 8th floor. Big explosion. Blew us back into the 8th floor. When we get outside, a police officer comes to me and says, you have to run. We have more information of bombs, so you have to run.
So the FBI has information of bombs here and telling them you got to run. They're seeing the stairwells itself damaged in an explosion. Now, all of this, by the way, is before any of the 2 towers came down. So something's going on inside the building with all these explosions, which are heard, in fact, the late morning of 9/11. And in this case, of course, after the towers came down, because you can see the litter and dust, powdered concrete.
I have a question. Are any of these witnesses alive still?
Well, that one was murdered the day before the final NIST report came out in 2008. It's really quite a story. But the other ones I presume are. So, and these guys I presume are.
Yeah, here's one of the guys who can tell you I'm okay, all right? Here, hold on. You want to call your mother or something?
So they say these sounds that you thought were explosions are one floor falling on another. Well, no building is collapsing at this time, and it's obviously an explosion. So NIST says they interviewed hundreds of witnesses, but none of these apparently, because they claim there's no witnesses of explosions anywhere, by the way, other than the 2 plane explosions and some explosions in the lobby, which they claim are jet fuel leaking down the elevator hoistways, which we'll get to next time. But we have evidence of extreme heat by Abulhassan Astani Azal, a UC Berkeley structural engineering professor, who says, I saw melting of girders at the World Trade Center. Well, this is a World Trade Center 7, Building 7 piece of steel. Now, guess what? Fires do not do this to steel. And yet, he says, the author of the FEMA report, Jonathan Barnett, says steel members in the debris pile appear to have been partly evaporated in extraordinarily high temperatures. The New York Times reports this. There's a problem here, though. It takes 4,000 degrees temperature to evaporate steel. It takes 2,800 Fahrenheit to begin to melt it. And yet the office fires are only 500 degrees Fahrenheit to 1,000 degrees Fahrenheit max. So none of the official story can explain these extreme temperatures. In fact, the owner of the cleanup company, CDI, Curiously Controlled Demolition Inc., says molten steel was found at World Trade Center 7. Wait a minute. We've got molten steel. What can cause that? Well, even the FEMA report that came out in May of 2002, the first report says, puts a metallurgical examination of the steel in their Appendix C of the Building Performance Assessment Team report. What does it say? Never before observed eutectic reactions, intergranular melting, solid steel girder turning into Swiss cheese, like you see here in this piece of World Trade Center 7 steel. So you see, this can't happen in normal office fires. And by the way, it can't happen with jet fuel either. Jet fuel is essentially kerosene. It only burns at 600 degrees in open air, according to its own manufacturer, 600 degrees Fahrenheit. And yet, again, no plane hit Building 7, so we're not even talking about that in this case. Well, rapid oxidation sulfidation, they're talking about the deepest mystery uncovered in the investigation. By the way, liquid iron. What is liquid iron? That's molten iron. That's, again, 2,800 degrees Fahrenheit minimum. Hot corrosion attack on the steel. Perhaps the deepest mystery uncovered. But this report was completely removed from the NIST report when they took over the investigation in 2002. The whole Appendix C, the entire document, was completely removed. And they claim then no steel was recovered from Building 7. Well, we just showed you that piece of steel. In fact, I'll show it to you again. Here's John Gross, the project leader of the NIST report, standing on the pile, documenting the very piece of steel that was given to FEMA to use in the Appendix C metallurgical examination. He denies the evidence, but his shadow is all over it. They can't get away with this, not if we all cry out for a new investigation. See, hydrocarbons, buildings, and jet fuel, they only burn 600 to 1,400 degrees Fahrenheit. So we have a huge problem here, right? Steel had definitely melted. Here it is melting falling out of the material held in the crab claw excavator. We can tell by the color of molten metals what their temperature is. Here we're exceeding 2,500 degrees. Well, how do we get there? When NIST completely denies these temperatures, here's the evidence though, right? They can't. What caused the steel to melt? In fact, is thermite a possibility? Well, interestingly, thermite is an incendiary used by the military to cut through steel like a hot knife through butter. But it would leave 3 telltale signs. 1, extreme temperatures, 4,000 degrees, because that's what it does. 2, molten iron, that's elemental iron, not structural steel. 3, sulfur. And we already saw the examples of sulfur formed on the structural steel. So what did the U.S. Geological Survey in their extensive testing of thousands of of dust samples throughout the World Trade Center, what's in this stuff? It's fascinating. It came out in 2006. Billions of previously molten, meaning 2,800 degrees Fahrenheit minimum, iron meaning not steel. Where does iron come from? Microspheres, about the diameter of a human hair. How do they get spherical? This is really quite a problem because thermite issues molten iron, not steel, but molten iron at 4,000 degree temperatures. And if you add sulfur to thermite, it becomes even more effective, becomes thermate at cutting through steel. So up to 6% of these samples are these billions of previously molten iron microspheres, up to about 4 tons of them. By extrapolation, you can figure it out. So there's no accounting for these spheres at all. And yet the EPA uses it as a signature element identifying the World Trade Center dust from common office building dust. It's not even World Trade Center dust unless it has these billions of molten iron microspheres, but we don't know where they came from. It's a complete mystery to us. Here's where they come from. You can burn thermite, even in this small experiment. Looks like thousands of sparks slowing it down. They're molten iron droplets. They cool and they fall in the pan. Could that be what's responsible for the toasting of the tops of the cars around the World Trade Center, which we have in a longer presentation? You see, when you aerosolize liquids, they form themselves into spheres by surface tension. That's how they get spherical. Well, you can make thermite cutter charges in your own backyard like John Cole did. It's not that difficult. It's just aluminum powder and iron oxide. Aluminum powder and iron oxide. That's like essentially rust and small pieces of aluminum. You can buy it on eBay. You can light it with a high temperature igniter. Well, if that was evidence of ignited thermite, which it can only be, by the way, there's no other explanation in or outside of the official narrative. Thermite does that. Nothing else does that. Leaves those signatures. Or this. A small team of scientists led by Niels Harrit in Copenhagen examined 7 independently collected samples of dust, and they tested them. What do they find? The paint chips is what they thought they found, but then they're attracted by a magnet, so they have a high iron content. Well, they get real curious. What's iron? One of the ingredients of thermite, right? Essentially rust. Well, you have these chips that are about a 16th of an inch long. They get real curious and they do testing on the red layer, and they find the ingredients of thermite in the red layer of all of these chips that they found in all of the dust samples independently collected. They find aluminum. They find iron. Fe is iron. So what are the ingredients of thermite doing in these chips? Oh, they get real curious now. They zoom in 50,000 times and they find iron oxide crystals and aluminum platelets at the nanoscale, 1,000 times smaller than the diameter of a human hair. This is extremely powerful engineered stuff. They've taken an incendiary thermite and engineered it much more sophisticated down to a small scale. And they put it in a heater, a differential scanning calorimeter. And what happens when they heat it? These chips produce molten iron microspheres with the same chemical signature as the molten iron microspheres found by the U.S. Geological Survey. It's identical. So we know exactly where all those molten iron microspheres came from. They came from these chips. As if we didn't know, they're found attached to partially ignited red-gray chips, red on one side, gray on the other. They're dual layered. They were formed as a liquid, applied as a liquid. And so we have a set of self-corroborating, repeatable experimental data that can be used in a court system to bring the real perpetrators of 9/11 to justice. See, this was developed before 9/11 by Lawrence Livermore Lab. It's called super thermite. By the time you get these particles at the nanoscale, they become, the surface volume increases exponentially. So you have a much faster chemical reaction, becoming more explosive than incendiaries themselves. This is not made in a cave in Afghanistan. This is made only in the most advanced defense contracting laboratories. So any enterprising journalist who really wants to get at the truth could do some digging around and find out who makes this stuff. Why is it in the World Trade Center? All of this evidence is documented in a 25-page peer-reviewed paper in the Bentham Open Chemical Physics Journal. It's an active, unreacted thermitic material incorporating nanotechnology, and it's highly energetic, pyrotechnic, or explosive. So you see, it's all there. And why didn't they do a real analysis, an investigation? Another parallel between 9/11 and COVID, by the way, no real investigation. And destruction of evidence as well. Another parallel. This is easily the largest and most perplexing structural failures in history, all three of them. But you have 400 truckloads a day starting just 2 weeks after 9/11, pulling the steel out of the pile, taking it and being put on barges sent to China for recycling. This is before investigators could get their hands on it and do a proper forensic investigation. This is the destruction of evidence in a crime scene. It's a crime all by itself. So that's why we have 3,600 now architects and engineers demanding a real investigation into not only Building 7, but as we'll see, the Twin Towers and all three of these high rises. This evidence has gone to the U.S. attorney for a special grand jury with 60 exhibits. Now we're making a film out of bringing the 60 exhibits alive. And so we're partway through the production of the film. Phase 1 is done. It's in the can. We're editing it. That's Building 7. Phase 2 is the Twin Towers. And we're going to go back to DC in a month and a half and 2 months. And we're going to film the evidence for the Twin Towers and the experts. We have like 24 experts in their fields going into this. So that's what I wanted to share with you.
Dang.
Yeah.
I know this is going to be absolutely, I hate to use the word explosive. This series that we have, this continuing series that we have with you, Richard, and Bruce and Diana, in the truths, the unanswered questions is the name of the rumble that Bruce and Diana have right now for 911. And how can people contact you, Richard?
Well, I have a website. Guess what? It's right here. RichardGage911.org. You can see the progress we're making with the film 9/11 Crime Scene to Courtroom. We're partnering with the Lawyers Committee for 9/11 Inquiry because there's a whole legal analysis and advice to the grand jury. And we're trying other ways to get this material to the grand jury, now going to a federal judge to submit it directly to the grand jury, since the U.S. attorney has been gatekeeping this material. And that's what happens in New York. You got to keep trying until you get in and get your investigation. Never stop.
We have about 10 minutes for questions, ladies. Any questions? Rainey, do you have any questions?
Yeah, I have a question. What would be the motivation?
The motivation for the inside job of 9/11? Well, because Building 7 housed, for instance, thousands of files related to hundreds of cases in the Securities and Exchange Commission on the 12th and 13th floor, where the worst fires were, interestingly, that they lost those cases. And those were huge cases. They were about to bring everybody down.
Well, the Enron case, right?
Enron and WorldCom, yeah.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. And so that's one possibility of bringing Building 7 down. It's been rebuilt now. It was already an aging building, even though it was built in '86. But the Twin Towers themselves were dinosaurs. They only had half occupancy, according to some researchers. They couldn't get people to come in because it required like $10 billion in mechanical, electrical, and communication system upgrades. And so they were full of asbestos. Every time somebody moved in, did any kind of alteration, they had to do a complete asbestos abatement. And that was over $5 billion itself.
Wow.
So why would Larry buy these buildings, which were dinosaurs, $3.2 billion? Well, he walked away with $5.68 billion. For one thing, he did very well in this gamble. He only put 15 to 100 million of his own money, depending on how you count it. So most people say 15 million. He turned that into 5.68 billion. That's how he could afford to rebuild there. We also have the Project for a New American Century, which put on their website prior to 9/11 their goals. And this is a group of neocons, a neocon think tank. They wanted regional hegemony in the Middle East, which would be benefiting Israel even more so than ourselves. The deep state interests in the Middle East, as well as a vast increase in the military budget. So, but they said that absent a catalyzing and catastrophic event like a new Pearl Harbor, these goals will take a long, long time to realize. And Bush writes in his diary, we had our new Pearl Harbor today. So we have the invasion of Iraq and Afghanistan. 2 million people were killed, by the way. And we have a vast increase in the military budget, $48 billion immediately following this event. So who benefits financially? The arms industry, the oil industry, the banking industry, the insurance industry, all of whom control collectively by ownership the media, 95% of which is owned by just 5 corporations. So all of these work together and with censorship and propaganda, they can control the narrative, driving the American people manipulatively to war. And now, not only that, but as Ed Snowden came out later, we now know that we've lost our civil liberties through the Patriot Act, the Military Commissions Act, and the National Defense Authorization Act of 2012, in which now all of our emails, texts, and phone calls are illegally recorded, and nobody's doing anything about it.
Yeah.
We all just go, oh, I've got nothing to hide.
Right. The NSA has the Utah Data Center, which acquires terabytes of data per second. I think they're on petabytes now, or petabytes. Petabytes.
I have a question. This nano or super thermite, at the time that this occurred, there's obviously evidence that it was there. Was it known that it existed? Were there patents available? Like, is there documentation as to where it could have come from?
Yeah. Lawrence Livermore Lab developed this along with Los Alamos Lab well before 9/11. And it's called super thermite. So who manufactures it in the quantities that would have been necessary? I mean, many tons of it. I don't know.
maybe the DOD in some capacity. I found that fascinating. I found everything about the disclosure on this extremely fascinating. I entreat people to go to your website because it's extremely important. I am so thankful that this team is here for disclosure every other week. Myself, I was texting one of the girls, and I said one of my ex-husbands, I found out I was involved in some covert stuff, unbeknownst to me, that she was at Livermore Laboratories. She worked there. One of my husband's first girlfriends. She also told me she worked at Gitmo. I'm like, who are you, right? Just fascinating stuff. Any more questions, Bruce? Do you have
I
some?
just had a quick question. Richard, you do not see, to clarify, you don't see any evidence of some type of nuclear reaction that might have occurred with the collapse of the towers? Because I know that's a sort of novel theory. I believe Heinz, Palmer, and others have been sort of talking about that one lately. Do you see anything to that?
I don't know. If nuclear weapons were used, there'd be an incredible blast. And there were seismic indicators of large blasts coupled to the ground. But we believe those are the explosions necessary to take out the structure. And that blast would have blown out the gypsum board enclosures around each of the elevator hoistways, because that's just, you can put your fist through that stuff, right? A blast before it traveled from the bottom, according to those guys, all the way up to the top at the point of jet plane impacts, and then started blowing out the building from there down to the ground. No, it's ludicrous, the whole theory on that basis alone. But also you'd see bright flashes, 100 times brighter than the sun. You'd hear these blasts throughout lower Manhattan, throughout New York, in fact. But they say, no, these are fourth generation nukes. So they don't do blasts or bright flashes or even radiation levels on the order of what we're familiar with nuclear weapons. Well, we can't talk about on the debate. We can't put on the table the evidence for fourth generation nukes, which we don't have the evidence for. It's I think it's a distraction. I've shown just today with the evidence for thermite in its ignited and unignited format. It's forensic evidence. We see individual blasts coming out of the Twin Towers. When we come back, we'll talk about those. And these are small explosions relatively at the point of jet plane impacts in each of the towers. And those would be pre-placed. And that's how you could get explosions traveling down the towers and emitting out of the towers at 20 feet, 40 feet, even 60 feet below the zone of destruction. These mistimed explosions, if you will.
Well, we're running short on time. I want to thank all of you for being here, Richard, Diana, and Bruce. We're going to see you back in 2 weeks. Hopefully, Richard, are you coming back?
I'd be happy to come back.
God, I love you. This is just fascinating, and I want to entreat our audience. This is the time that they're going to be here every other week, and so please come back and join us. And thank you all for coming on the Awake Nation, and I look forward to more information coming forth from your team. Thank you so very much.
Thank
Appreciate
you
all.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Yes.